Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So it's the end of the week in which Theresa May celebrated, if that's the right word, her first 12 months as Prime Minister. So, Fraser, it hasn't exactly gone to plan, if that's an understatement of the year.
Nothing has gone to plan for Theresa May in the last sort of 4 or 5 months. But, you know, she's still here, which is a lot more than a lot of people thought she would be on election night. And she's sort of testing something which is quite new for British politics. Somebody we all know she's going to resign. It's not like Gordon Brown, where we thought he should resign but will probably hang on. Everybody knows she will walk the plank at some point, but nobody knows who will succeed her. And until her party can make up their minds, then she will stay. So we've got this kind of undead Prime Minister here politically, and it's a strange sight.
Well, the undead or zombie Prime Minister, as she has been described. When do you think that will be, the walking the plank, then, if we take Fraser Nelson's view?
Well, she's given herself a few years, and actually I think she might be right about that, because we don't know the exact deadline, but ironically her weakness is keeping her in place. No Conservative MP wants to destabilise things when Jeremy Corbyn is at a high, partly because of Theresa May's weakness in the campaign.
Now, she maintains, though, still in that recent interview, that it was the right decision to call the general election. Is that still the line to take, or would it be better to admit that it was a mistake?
I don't think there are many people in the country other than Theresa May who would say that the decision to call the election was the right decision. I mean, she might have meant that had things gone to plan, it would have been a good decision. But it was obviously the biggest self-inflicted wound in the history of the Conservative Party. And I think she has probably inflicted more damage on that party than anybody since Tony Blair.
Now, one Conservative MP said to me she's also made Jeremy Corbyn electable. What have we learnt about British politics in the last few months?
We've learnt that you shouldn't take people for granted. I think the Conservatives, the reason they called that election was because they saw such a weak Labour leader trailing in the polls. But as soon as you start attacking someone and making personal attacks like they did in the campaign, the public react differently and it might backfire.
What about the mea culpa, then, in that sense? Should there have been more of that?
Oh, I don't know. Well, she said that she shed a tear, which for her is quite a big deal. And then she claimed that I immediately thought of the message the electorate had sent me. Well, there was no sign of her taking that message on board for quite a few weeks. It still seems like quite a staged mea culpa. But I'll say this for her. A lesser Prime Minister would just have quit and walked away, as David Cameron did after the Brexit vote. I mean, she knows this is going to be, you know, hell for her. It's going to be an awful position, but she's sticking with it because she feels a sense of duty to the party. So for that, she does deserve great credit.
And the sense of duty is important, isn't it? You could, as you said at the beginning or alluded to, she's the great survivor.
Yes, and of course her decision to stand for the leadership in the first place was quite brave. No one really wanted to inherit the Brexit negotiations.
No, although I think she'd obviously had in mind for a while that she could become leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, the Brexit negotiations, if we then go back to her Lancaster House speech that she is still referring to, is that going to continue to be the template?
Yes, I think so. I think it's a very optimistic, persuasive template, her Lancaster House speech. And also, it's funny to think that only, 11, 12 weeks ago, we were looking at the local election results for Tories. Everything she did seemed to be being vindicated. So what we've learned is just how quickly British politics can shift and how quickly certainties can vanish and people you've written off can be knocking on the door of Downing Street.
Right, but what does that say then about support? That it's actually really very soft and very flaky on both sides?
Yeah, and things can change. So it's almost as if the Conservatives' prospects have flipped over and they reflect what Labour was suffering before the election. That could flip back again.
Now, just lastly, I mean, can she do human now?
Look, she is never going to be one of life's raconteurs, one of life's great, wear my emotions on my sleeve. I think the public can see her for what she is, which is somebody who does have a huge sense of duty, who works very hard, but does find it difficult to say, please come and be my best friend. That's just not how she works. Other politicians do that, she doesn't. But in a way, it doesn't really matter because she will not be standing for election again.
So, Theresa May's second year in Downing Street is now underway. If you believe Jeremy Corbyn, then the government is clapped out and he'll have her job before Christmas. But allies of the Prime Minister say that she can carry on for years. So, if you'll excuse the naval metaphor, let's take a look at what's in the offing for Theresa May's government in the year ahead. A top priority is, of course, to sail the ship of state through the Brexit negotiations. Face-to-face talks between the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, and the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, will resume this Monday. Yesterday, the government introduced the repeal bill. This will overturn the 1972 legislation that took the UK into the common market and also convert EU law into UK law. The opposition parties are very keen to amend the bill. The Liberal Democrat leader Tim Farron even said that the passage of the bill will be hell for the government. And there are several other bills related to Brexit on the horizon, like the customs bill, the immigration bill and the trade bill. After the summer recess, the Chancellor Philip Hammond will present his first autumn budget. He'll be under pressure to yield to calls for him to end the 1% pay cap on public sector pay. But the government's economic strategy got a boost from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility yesterday. The fiscal watchdog suggested that ending austerity and increasing spending could pose a significant risk to the public finances. And in the Queen's speech, we got a sense of the government's other priorities, including a consultation on social care, an industrial strategy to boost growth, and a review of counter-terrorism policy. Well, joining me now is Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng, who is Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Chancellor Philip Hammond. And from Middlesbrough, we're joined by Shadow Transport Secretary Andy MacDonald. Welcome to both of you. Kwasi, Tim Farron, as I read out there, of the Liberal Democrats, says that the repeal bill will be hell for the government. And he's also promised a parliamentary version of guerrilla warfare. Well, that's something to look forward to, isn't it, Kwasi? What are you going to do about it?
Well, I think Tim Farron obviously has his own agenda, and he was the leader in a campaign for the Liberal Democrats, which didn't do very well. The fact is that both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are committed to Brexit. I think that we can get a majority, a decent majority for certainly repealing the European Communities Act across the House. It'll be difficult, but I think we can do that. And I think Tim Farron is not reflecting really the mood of the House of Commons. He has 12 MPs. He himself resigned because he did so badly. And I don't think he's in really a position to talk about guerrilla warfare. I think we will be able to get this thing through.
But the fact that he's promising it, he's saying it, of course, against a backdrop because he knows that even with the Article 50 legislation, that there are a group of Conservative MPs who are looking for an opportunity, if you like, to oppose a bill like the repeal bill, at least with amendments to it. And that could be enough to make life very difficult and water down the bill. Do you accept that?
Well, let's see. I mean, you will remember that before the election, we had Article 50 legislation, we had about 9 votes. I'd never seen anything like it. We went through the division lobbies very many times. And if you actually looked at those division lists and saw the Conservative rebels, there were very few of them, maybe 2 or 3. And the majorities that we secured then were much more safe than people had anticipated. Now, I agree that the situation now is more difficult, but I'd be surprised to see the number of rebels that I've read about in the papers. I don't think it'll be as many as 15 at all.
Right.
And I think the party's quite united and quite determined to see us through this process.
Seeing it through may be, but not without amendments, changes, perhaps a bit of frustrating the bill. I mean, you only have to look at the opposition. Labour, obviously, have promised to amend it. We've had the Liberal Democrats with Tim Farron. We've got the SNP saying similar things. If you add all those up, and actually 15 Conservative MPs is not a massive number, then the odds are stacked against you.
Well, 2 things. I mean, I don't think it's as high as 15, and I've given the reasons why. And also, you're assuming that the opposition is completely united, whereas we know that there are Labour MPs who voted for Brexit. We know there are Labour MPs like Caroline Flint who've also said that they don't want freedom of movement. And they are representing constituencies where a large proportion, a majority of their constituents, voted to leave. So I don't think it's as simple as you suggest.
Let's ask Andy MacDonald on the Labour side. Welcome to the programme. Talking on the repeal bill specifically, you're asking the government for a whole range of concessions. The government probably won't give you everything that you want. So in all likelihood, are you just going to vote against the repeal bill?
I think we'll be voting for our amendments, but I think the principle of the repeal bill is accepted, but it's upon what terms and what comes afterwards. I mean, we've set out very clearly, embracing David Davis's own words of the exact same benefits and making sure that we're still parties to important organisations, Euratom, EASA and so on. These have served us well, and it's absolutely imperative that we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we don't throw away 40 years of benefits.
Right, are those
We've
red
got
lines,
to work
Andy
our way
McDonald?
through this.
Are those red lines for Labour? Because if you listen to Keir Starmer, who is shadowing on the Brexit side for Labour, want to see the incorporation of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, then that means you can't vote for the repeal bill as it stands.
Well, we'll see. I think we've got to have a pragmatic and sensible approach to this.
But what does that
and
mean?
hopefully the government will now start to talk. Well, there's been, Theresa May obviously recognises the weakness of her own position and is trying to reach out to other parties to help her out. That for me does signal there is some sense that there's going to have to be some elements of compromise.
On what,
now,
though?
it's not
That's
going to
what
be
all I'm trying to establish.
That's too early for me to say, Joe. The bill was published yesterday.
Yeah, except we've already
and
heard from Keir
sure
Starmer on the European Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Yeah.
Is that a red line for Labour?
Keir will make that clear. I'm not going to step into his shoes and start saying what are red lines and what are not. But I think there's the ability there to have that sensible, pragmatic discussion about what can be achieved, so that we don't end up with the impact of us leaving the European Union making the people of this country much worse off. So he's going to have those discussions, and I think we've got to give people the chance to make some progress on these hugely important areas for us, because to start shouting the odds at this stage,
right.
I'm afraid that's where the Tories got themselves into difficulties in the first instance, by having such an intransigent view with their European partners, rather than saying we're going to have to talk about this and negotiate.
Let's put that to Kwasi Kwarteng. We don't yet know, it seems, or not from Andy McDonald, exactly the areas that they are going to try and change and amend, but they obviously are going to try and do it. But if we look at this European Charter of Fundamental Rights, would you be prepared to give way on that?
I don't know what. I mean, obviously that's way above my pay grade. Let's look at the actual. No, but hang on. Let's look at the actual bill and let's see what the amendments are. But the fact is that to say that the opposition is completely united is false, because we saw in the Queen's speech, Chukwuemeka put down an amendment. 49 Labour MPs voted in favour of that, but a large proportion, the majority of the party, didn't. So, before you move on, I just want to say very clearly that I think you've got a very simplified picture of the parliamentary arithmetic, and there are splits, certainly on the Labour side. I think the Conservative Party is more united than you have assumed, and I think we'll be able to get something.
Well, let's just talk about the dilemma for Labour, Andy McDonald, if you like, that Kwasi Kwarteng is talking about. It is true that Caroline Flint is very keen to emphasise to you and other Labour colleagues that the party must stick with what it promised, which is leaving the single market because you promised to end freedom of movement, and to leave the EU in the way her constituents would like to see. That is at complete odds with the constituents in Keir Starmer's constituency, or Jeremy Corbyn's, or Emily Thornberry's. How are you going to satisfy both?
Well, the result was clear. It was close at 52-48, but people voted to leave. And if you leave the European Union, you do leave the single market. Now, the art form and the discussion has got to be about securing the best benefits of the single market, as David Davis has pointed out. And if it comes to freedom of movement, well, we accept that does go if you leave the single market. But what comes in its place? It's the ability for us now to look at migration and have a policy that serves our economy in our interests. And we can do that very sensibly. It doesn't mean pulling up of the drawbridge. It means that having an active immigration policy where people are welcome into our country to help us in the areas where we need their skills and their abilities.
Well, you sound there as if you're quite...
a sensible attitude.
Yeah, you sound there as if you're fairly close to the Conservatives on those two things, if we take it broadly. I'm just going to bring in my other guest, Andy McDonald. I'll come back to you. I mean, how difficult is this going to be for both parties to pull off?
Well, actually, their problems are quite similar. Their divisions are quite similar. All of them have MPs who represent constituents who would much rather stay in, whether for financial reasons or for cultural reasons, and they have constituents who voted to leave. So their divisions are quite similar. But Kwasi talks about Labour being divided. Yes, it's divided on Brexit and a little bit confused about what it wants out of the bill, but what it is united in is making things as difficult as possible for a very weak government. and the Tories shouldn't underestimate that.
And is the repeal bill going to be the place where that opposition is going to come to the fore, the fight against the Conservatives and, in some people's minds, the fight against Brexit?
Any legislation passed through the government is an opportunity for Labour to try to make common cause of Tory rebels and defeat the government. It doesn't really matter if it's about the EU or parking fines, anything. You would take a chance to inflict a defeat or think of something nobody thought of before, like the provision of abortion for women in Northern Ireland. You take something like that and try to get the government to do a concession. Now, the Great Repeal Bill is kind of misnamed because all it's doing
Not the Great, of course, is it anymore?
No, and nor is it really repealing. It's just taking regulation from the EU regulation and making it into British law. It's the Great Regulation Bill, if you like. But because there's so much of it, this creates lots of opportunities to embarrass the government.
All right, before we move on, just briefly, Andy MacDonald, what is more important to you and your Labour colleagues, getting rid of this Conservative government or seeing through the Brexit negotiations?
Well, both. They're both important. They're hugely important.
But you might use the Brexit negotiations to get rid of this government.
Well, I mean, Theresa May thought she was going to have this massive mandate for her to do as she wished, and that's just not going to happen now. She knows that, and that's why she's in difficulties and not bringing anything to the floor of the House of Commons, because she knows she'll have the devil's own job to progress anything. But we're going to be acting in the best interest of this country and making sure that we get the best possible bill that we can, and it sensibly addresses the needs of our people. And for goodness sake, what else should we do?
Let's move on to the economy, because Philip Hammond will give his autumn budget. If you're going to listen to some of the voices inside the Cabinet and other Tory backbenchers who are asking for the 1% public sector pay cap to be lifted, is that something you can support?
I don't think, well, certainly not. We're not going to rewrite the budget halfway through the year. There'll be a budgetary event, as you suggested.
But we've had lots of discussions about the pay cap. What's your view?
I have not any idea what will be in the November budget. I think for now, it was very important that the government held the line. I think deficit reduction is incredibly important. I think people understand that. We've done very well in that over the last 7 years. It's gone from 150 billion, the deficit, to 50 billion. That's important. And the idea that if a Labour government came in, we would see further progress on this is not correct. It's fanciful. I mean, the IFS themselves have said that Labour's plans would cost £100 billion more, would add to the deficit, £100 billion over the course of a 5-year parliament.
Right.
I mean, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of debt.
Actually, Andy MacDonald, the Office for Budget Responsibility suggested that austerity fatigue and increased spending could pose a significant risk to the public finances. Does that not blow a hole in your whole economic argument?
Well, at least we set out with in some detail what our spending plans were and where the money would come from. We've heard nothing from the Tory party. And look, they missed their targets. They have done ever since 2010, and they just keep putting them back and back. And now we're going to get to 2025.
I'm asking you about your economic arguments, because if the Office for Budget Responsibility is saying that spending to, if you like, mitigate the effects of austerity as Labour see it, and increasing spending are going to pose a significant risk, particularly with some of the uncertainties around Brexit, is that a responsible economic argument for Labour to be putting forward?
Well, is it really responsible to have a plan whereby our nurses are working flat out and not having sufficient money to get through the week, where families are £1,400 a year worse off as a result of austerity, whilst giving the tax breaks to the very, very richest in our society? There's something morally bankrupt about that, and there's got to be a better distribution of the wealth of our nation.
Okay, well, let me put that to quaz. Let me put morally bankrupt, says Andy MacDonald, and actually isn't the sort of proof in the pudding the result of the election? Because you're not listening to the public when it comes to things like pay and cost of living, and look at rates of inflation hitting 3%, the squeeze on people's pay now, it's a big cut. If, the average pay is about sort of 1.8%, the average pay rise, 3% inflation, people can't afford things in the way they could. You need to change your policy.
Well, I'll say 3 things to that. If you look at the economic management that we've had since 2010, we've reduced the deficit by 2/3.
I'm talking about now,
That's a substantial... No, because it's a broader debate about the economy. If we don't have a decent economy, people will suffer far more than if we have a well-run economy.
But people are saying they are suffering now because of the rise in inflation.
If we look at the alternative, We have the record numbers of employment. We have the lowest unemployment rate in 40 years. We've reduced the deficit by 2/3. And we've got, over the last 7 years, on a compounded annual basis, we've grown faster than every other country
So
in
how
Europe.
do you
So
deal
this
with
is
the
a
squeeze?
I'm just establishing before
Sure,
you.
I understand
this
that.
is a good record. Now, with respect to the squeeze, we accept that there are difficulties in terms of rising living costs. But what I would say is that the alternative, if you go down a Labour route, you will not only wreck the economy, you will actually increase the debt, you will increase, you could potentially certainly increase inflation, and you could increase interest rates. And that would be very damaging to people on lower incomes.
Annie MacDonald?
Well, that's absolutely ludicrous. You know, more pain to inflict upon the most vulnerable and the worst off in our society. I'll challenge Kwasi to come to my constituency and come into some of the territories where people are really suffering under this Tory regime since 2010. They are having the toughest of times, and yet we sit back and think this all in the garden is rosy. It certainly isn't for many, many millions of people in this country. And for him to suggest that, you know, this is a success story, I'd hate to look at see what failure would look like. This has been a miserable time for the thousands and millions of people right across this land, and it's about time the Tories woke up to that, because there's a huge outpouring and there's an embracing of Labour's message to say that we can order our society in a totally different way, and we cannot simply go on pandering to the very richest in our society.
Well,
they can afford to pay a little more.
Kwasi, a quick response. We were told that you're not deaf as a government.
Well, Fraser will know that the richest 1% are paying more as a proportion of tax than they ever have done.
But is that making nurses feel better, or teachers feel better about the cost of living?
No, I've accepted that the cost of living is an issue, and we will have to address it. We have addressed it with regard to the personal allowance. We more than doubled that. So the rate at which you pay tax is much higher.
All right.
You start paying tax is much higher now than was ever the case in the past.
Thank you both very much. Just very briefly, is this where the argument is going to be? Putting Brexit to one side just slightly, looking at the economic tussle between the two parties?
Yes, it's going to be about fairness. I think the Tories have got a very strong story to tell. I mean, look at whose incomes have gone up in the last 6 years, whose have gone down. The ones at the bottom are the ones whose incomes have gone up, and it's the richest whose incomes have fallen the most. The Conservatives have been progressive. Tough time for everybody, but those at the bottom have been protected by progressive Conservative reform.
Is that how you see it, Anush?
No, I think the argument for austerity has been lost. I mean, Theresa May dropped George Osborne's fiscal rules. She didn't make it her priority, so it's very difficult for the Conservatives to bring it back at the top of their agenda again.
Thank you both, Kwasi, Andy MacDonald.
Thank you.